I walked out of this movie feeling like a proud American. Wait. American Snipers, directed by Clint Eastwood, written by Jason Hall. It's based on the autobiography of the American sniper himself, Chris Kyle, with the help of Scott McEwen and Jim DeFelice, and this movie stars Bradley Cooper and Sienna Miller. An American Sniper pretty much is a biopic about this guy. He's the deadliest sniper in US military history. He's had 160 confirmed kills, which is a lot, and this movie basically follows his 4 tours of duty, mostly in Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, and it also observes his relationship with his wife Taya and the strain that begins to be put on the relationship. Now, honestly, I really wasn't aware of this movie until the Oscar nominations came in, so I watched it solely because of that. And I was thinking, like, this movie has to prove itself to me now. And I will say that I did find American Sniper to be very well directed and very, very well acted, but ultimately it just kind of feels thrown together without really knowing what it wants to be. Visually, I do think that American Sniper gets a lot of its military stuff down pat. It all feels very genuine. The production design in general, the costumes, the makeup, the guns, and whatever, they all feel like the real military stuff. And some people might argue that the places that Chris Kyle goes to during his 4 tours of duty might look the same, but honestly, those places do kind of look the same, and I think it works for this movie because it gives the war scenes that like an extra kind of psychological dimension. It feels like Chris Kyle has been on the same battlefield forever. Just like any good war movie, the sound is very loud and proud, but it also knows when to cut out or to just kind of reduce itself to this thumping that also adds to the psychological aspect. Overall, it's a very sleek looking movie. One scene in particular I think really stands out is like the sandstorm action scene that happens near the end, which I thought was great because you really couldn't see anything, and the way they did it again also just added to the psychological aspect. Now, I will say that I did think Bradley Cooper was very, very good in this movie. His performance isn't just in his physicality, he's huge here, or in his voice. I really think he got that accent very, very well. But it's also in his decision to just kind of play Chris Kyle's post-traumatic stress disorder as a very kind of restrained and subtle thing. The action scenes themselves don't really give him that much space to act, really, but that kind of hollowness he displays on the battlefield, just killing person after person, contrasts very well with the few like real emotional scenes he has throughout the movie, where he's able to show that this guy has this vulnerability, and it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere. It feels like it's coming out of this guy's experiences. Sienna Miller barely has anything to work with, but she maximizes every second she's on screen as Chris Kyle's wife. She really kind of shows how much strain is being put on this relationship, and whenever you see her, she's always just a bit more fed up, and I think she did that very, very well. And Clint Eastwood is always a very capable director, especially with his action scenes. I thought every single action sequence in this movie had this flow to it. It always felt like there was a real objective at stake, and they were all very, very tense. But even with the domestic scenes with just Chris Kyle and his family, felt very genuine, felt very real. And he was able also to put lots of little psychological elements in there, like when Chris Kyle is just at home, he sees these things that remind him of the battlefield, or he has to make these he has to make these moral decisions on the battlefield that really kind of take a toll on him. I thought those were like probably the best parts of the movie. But ultimately, these little glimpses of this deeper psychological trauma for me just ultimately weren't enough, because they were just overwhelmed by like the machismo and the overt patriotism that this movie displayed. And ultimately, the screenplay is very flawed in that regard, in that it's just like an okay character study paired up with like an okay war movie. It never really excels at being either of those things, because it just kind of reduces the conflict in Iraq to being this black and white matter. And you could argue that this is just being told from the point of view of Chris Kyle. That's why it's so black and white. But ultimately the movie doesn't really justify that, because it just ends up heroizing Chris Kyle so much. It doesn't give any depth to his character. It doesn't show us the complexities of his character. And the movie really kind of just jumps from scene to scene without really giving us a solid through line to latch onto for us to really trace his psychological state. And the structure of the movie itself, like, it just kind of shows his tours of duty. It gets really repetitive, like by the third time. And the ending is also really super abrupt. They were trying, and I could tell they were trying to do it out of respect, but it just does not work when it's in a movie. And of course, much has been said about the shockingly obvious CGI and blood effects and prosthetic baby that really just take you out of it and rob the movie of its emotion. Ultimately, though, I can't ignore that I thought Bradley Cooper, Sienna Miller, and Clint Eastwood did very good jobs, so I will say that despite its flaws, American Sniper is still a pretty good watch. Watch it without really thinking about the nominations it doesn't deserve, and you'll have a better time. Alright, so those are my thoughts on American Sniper. What did you guys think of the movie? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.